Wait, before you throw away that old penny jar sitting in your grandma's drawer, stop. Right now. Because what I'm about to show you today could literally change your life. We are talking about 8 of the most jaw-dropping, heart-stopping, wallet-filling Australian 1-penny coins ever struck in the history of this nation. And here's the twist that nobody is talking about. The Australian government is now moving to ban these coins from leaving the country. That's right. These little copper discs are so historically powerful, so financially explosive, that the government itself is stepping in. So if you happen to have one of these sitting in a tin, a sock drawer, or an old biscuit box, you are going to want to watch every single second of this video. Let's count them down from number 8 all the way to the most valuable penny Australia has ever produced. Stay locked in. This is insane. Let's get started with coin number 8. The 1936 Australian 1-penny coin. Let's kick things off with number 8 on our list, and trust me, even the 8th spot on this countdown is enough to make a grown collector cry happy tears. We are starting with the 1936 Australian 1-penny coin, and oh boy, where do we even begin with this beauty? Now, at first glance, you might look at this coin and think, it's just a penny, it's just 1 cent, what could it possibly be worth? And that right there is the exact mistake that thousands of Australians have already made. They've tossed these coins, melted them, lost them in couches, or worse, spent them at a milk bar for an actual penny's worth of lollies. But those days of ignorance are over. Because today we are going to talk about exactly why this 1936 penny is sitting on this list and why it deserves every ounce of attention we are about to give it. The 1936 Australian 1-penny was minted during one of the most turbulent periods in world history. The year 1936 itself was extraordinary. King George V passed away in January of that year. Edward VIII briefly took the throne and then abdicated. And King George VI was preparing to take over the crown. This political chaos in Britain had a direct ripple effect on Australian coinage because Australia at the time was still striking coins under the British Royal Mint system, specifically through the Melbourne, Sydney, and Perth branches. That royal transition meant that die preparations, mint authorizations, and production schedules were all affected in ways that make certain 1936 pennies extraordinarily rare and special. Now let's talk about the coin itself physically. The 1936 Australian 1-penny features the obverse portrait of King George V, with the legend reading Jorgives Vide Gra Brit OMN Rex Fid Def Iende Imp surrounding the king's bust. The coin is composed of 97% copper with trace amounts of tin and zinc, measuring 31 millimeters in diameter and weighing 945 grams. But here is where things get absolutely wild. Among the 1936 pennies, there exists what collectors call the 1936 dot penny varieties, coins struck with a small but incredibly significant dot positioned near specific points on the die. These dot varieties were essentially pre-production test pieces or transitional coins prepared in anticipation of the new king's reign, and only an absolutely tiny number of them survived. When these dot varieties come up at auction, the bidding room goes absolutely electric. In standard circulated condition, a 1936 Australian penny in fine grade is already fetching between 3,000 and 8,000 Australian dollars, depending on the specific mint mark and strike quality. Move into very fine territory, and you are looking at figures between $12,000 and $25,000. Now push that coin into extremely fine or about uncirculated condition, and the numbers become genuinely breathtaking. We are talking 40,000 to 80,000 Australian dollars for a coin that was once worth 1 single penny. But if you are lucky enough to have a genuine 1936 dot variety, hold on to your hat. Certified examples of the 1936 dot penny have sold at Australian auction houses for figures ranging from 150,000 all the way to well over 300,000 Australian dollars. One particular specimen graded by PCGs at MS63 Red-Brown sold for amounts that made international numismatic headlines. These are not fairy tales, these are documented auction results from reputable houses including Downey's, Noble Numismatics, and stacks Bowers. And here is something that makes this coin even more urgent to discuss right now. The Australian government has recently been in discussions about tightening export controls on pre-decimal coinage of significant historical value. There are proposals being reviewed that would classify certain key-date Australian pennies as cultural heritage items, meaning you would need special permits to sell them overseas or to foreign collectors. International demand for Australian key-date pennies has been absolutely skyrocketing from American, British, and Asian collectors, and the government is watching very carefully. If these restrictions come into full force, the domestic market value of these coins could increase dramatically overnight simply because supply becomes legally restricted. So the 1936 penny, seemingly humble, visually modest, historically magnificent. If you find one in decent condition, please do not spend it. Do not clean it. Do not polish it. Take it to a professional numismatist, have it authenticated and graded, and then sit back and watch what happens when serious collectors come knocking on your door. Next up, coin number 7. The 1927 Australian 1 penny coin, moving right along to number 7, and we are stepping back nearly a decade to visit one of the most underrated yet genuinely exciting entries in Australian penny collecting, the 1927 Australian 1 penny coin. Now, 1927 was a landmark year for Australia in ways that go far beyond coinage. It was the year the federal parliament officially moved to Canberra, the brand new capital city that was purpose-built for the nation. The Duke and Duchess of York, who would later become King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, actually visited Australia in 1927 to officially open Parliament House in Canberra. The entire country was buzzing with national pride, patriotic energy, and a sense that Australia was truly coming into its own as an independent, proud, and powerful nation on the world stage. And yet, here is the fascinating contradiction. In the middle of all that national excitement, the Melbourne Mint was producing pennies that would decades later become some of the most sought-after pieces of copper in the entire Southern Hemisphere. The 1927 penny exists in several varieties depending on which mint produced it and under what specific die conditions the coins were struck. The Perth Mint and Melbourne Mint both contributed to the 1927 penny production, and the differences between their outputs are subtle but enormously significant to serious collectors. Let's get into the physical specifications again, because they matter. The 1927 penny carries the obverse portrait of King George V in the same style as other pennies of the era. But coin graders and variety specialists pay extraordinarily close attention to the specific characteristics of the 1927 dies: the depth of the king's portrait relief, the sharpness of the legend lettering, the positioning of the date numerals, and the overall surface quality of the planche before striking. These micro details are what separate a common 1927 penny worth a few $100s from a genuinely exceptional specimen worth tens of thousands. In good to fine condition, a standard 1927 Australian penny will set a buyer back somewhere between 2,500 and 7,000 Australian dollars. That is already remarkable for something originally worth 1 penny. In very fine to extremely fine condition, serious collectors are regularly paying between $15,000 and $35,000 to add a quality 1927 to their collection. And when you get into the uncirculated grades, MS60 through MS65, the figures become extraordinary, with premium examples graded by PCGs or NGC trading hands for anywhere from $60,000 to $120,000 Australian dollars. Now here is something that makes the 1927 penny particularly exciting in the current market. There has been a significant increase in young Australian collectors entering the hobby over the past several years. Many of them grew up hearing stories from grandparents about pennies being valuable, and now with greater access to auction data, online numismatic communities, and professional grading services, they are hunting these coins with absolute determination. This new wave of collector demand is pushing prices upward at a rate that veteran collectors find almost alarming. The era varieties within the 1927 penny series are where things become truly jaw-dropping. Coins struck with double dies, where the design elements show a ghostly doubling effect due to a misaligned or rehubbed working die, are extraordinarily rare and command prices that dwarf even high-grade normal examples. A confirmed 1927 double-die penny, properly attributed and certified, would easily command prices north of 200,000 Australian dollars at a major auction, and that might even be a conservative estimate given current collector appetite. There is also growing concern among Australian numismatists about the number of 1927 pennies that were melted during the decimalisation of Australian currency in 1966. When Australia switched from pounds, shillings, and pence to dollars and cents, millions of pre-decimal coins were handed in, melted down, and recycled. The exact survival population of high-grade 1927 pennies is genuinely unknown, and that uncertainty is a massive price driver. When nobody knows exactly how many mint-state examples survive, collectors pay premium prices to secure one whenever it comes available, because they know the next opportunity might be years away. Next up, coin number 6. The 1923 Australian 1 penny coin. We are into the top 6 now, and number 6 is where this countdown starts to get genuinely serious. Ladies and gentlemen, the 1923 Australian 1 penny coin, and if you have one of these, please sit down before you read what I'm about to tell you about its value. The year 1923 in Australia was marked by post-World War I economic recovery, and the mint was operating under significant budgetary and operational pressures. The aftermath of the Great War had left the Australian economy in a state of cautious reconstruction. Mint production priorities were carefully managed, resources were stretched, and certain denominations were produced in far lower quantities than normal. The 1923 penny is one of the direct beneficiaries of this historical circumstance, because the mintage figures for this year are genuinely, documentably, historically low. This is not hype. This is not collector folklore. The 1923 Australian penny is one of the recognized key dates in the entire Australian pre-decimal series, acknowledged by every major numismatic authority in the country. The Royal Australian Mint's own historical records and the comprehensive catalogues produced by leading Australian numismatic publishers all confirm that the 1923 penny was produced in very limited quantities, and the survival rate of high-grade examples is brutally, almost cruelly low. Think about what a coin goes through over a century of circulation. It gets passed from hand to hand, dropped on concrete floors, tossed in jars with keys and bottle caps, washed in pockets, scratched, worn, and abraded until the once sharp portrait of King George V becomes a smooth, ghostly outline, barely recognizable against the copper field. That is the fate of most circulated 1923 pennies, and in that heavily worn condition, they are still worth between 5,000 and 15,000 Australian dollars to the right collector. But a 1923 penny that somehow escaped heavy circulation, perhaps pulled from a mint bag by a careful collector in the 1920s, or discovered in a sealed envelope tucked inside an old family Bible, that is a completely different animal financially. In very fine condition, a 1923 penny commands between 25,000 and 50,000 Australian dollars. Push into extremely fine, and you're looking at 70,000 to 130,000 dollars. And a genuine uncirculated 1923 penny, graded MS60 or above by PCGs or NGC? We are potentially talking about figures between 250,000 and 500,000 Australian dollars depending on the grade and surface quality. $500,000. For a penny. Let that sink in for a moment. Now let's talk about the specific error varieties within the 1923 series, because this is where even experienced collectors sometimes miss out on extraordinary value. The 1923 penny is known to exist with several die cracks, fractures that developed in the working dies during the striking process and left raised lines across the coin's surface. While minor die cracks are relatively common on coins of this era, major die cracks that bisect the coin or cross through significant design elements are significant varieties that command substantial premiums. A 1923 penny with a dramatic, clearly visible die crack through the king's portrait has sold for prices well above the standard market value for its grade. There are also repunched date varieties known within the 1923 series, coins where the date numerals were punched into the die multiple times, resulting in a slight doubling or misalignment visible under magnification. These varieties require specialist knowledge to identify, but once confirmed and certified, they sit in a completely different value category from standard examples. The Australian government's growing interest in restricting the export of culturally significant pre-decimal coinage hits the 1923 penny particularly hard because overseas collectors, especially in the United States and United Kingdom, have been aggressively pursuing quality examples. American collectors in particular have a deep fascination with Commonwealth coinage, and the combination of rarity, history, and that gorgeous copper patina makes the 1923 Australian penny an absolute trophy piece for any serious world coin collection. Next up, coin number 5. The 1922 Australian 1 penny coin number 5, and we are absolutely cooking now. The 1922 Australian 1 penny coin. The quiet achiever of this entire countdown. A coin that doesn't always get the screaming headlines of some of its more famous counterparts, but which is steadily, consistently, powerfully building a reputation as one of the smartest purchases any collector in Australia can make right now. Let's paint the picture of Australia in 1922. The wounds of World War I were still raw and deeply felt across Australian society. The country had lost an astonishing proportion of its young men in the trenches of Europe and the beaches of Gallipoli, and the national mood was one of grief, resilience, and determined rebuilding. The Melbourne Mint continued its work producing the coins of everyday commerce, but the human and industrial disruptions of the post-war years meant that production was never entirely predictable or consistent. The 1922 penny presents collectors with a fascinating range of varieties and die states that make it a genuinely complex and rewarding series to study and collect. Unlike some coins where a single major variety defines the entire collector conversation, the 1922 penny rewards deep research and careful examination because there are multiple legitimate varieties that each carry their own distinct values and collector followings. One of the most exciting aspects of the 1922 penny is the existence of what specialists describe as the wide date and narrow date varieties, subtle but real differences in the spacing and positioning of the 4 date numerals as they were punched into the working dies. To the naked eye, these differences might seem trivial, but to a serious collector with a quality loupe or microscope, they are immediately visible and enormously significant. The rarer variety commands prices anywhere from 30 to 100% above the standard market value for the same grade. And being able to identify which variety you hold can be the difference between a coin worth $15,000 and one worth $45,000. In standard good-to-find circulated condition, a 1922 Australian penny is already trading in ranges of 2,000 to 6,000 Australian dollars. And that number has been climbing steadily as awareness of the series grows. Very fine examples are consistently achieving $10,000 to $25,000 at auction. Extremely fine examples push into the $35,000 to $75,000 range. And mint state examples, those magical survivors that somehow made it through over a century without entering circulation, are valued anywhere from $100,000 to $250,000 Australian dollars for the finest known specimens. The story of how mint state 1922 pennies survive is genuinely fascinating. Occasionally, small hordes of uncirculated pre-decimal coins are discovered in estate sales, in the locked drawers of deceased collector estates, or in bank vaults that somehow held on to bags of the original mint production for decades. Each time such a discovery comes to light, it sends ripples through the collecting community, excitement about new material coming to market, but also anxiety that supply is being augmented. However, given the age of these coins and the century of economic turbulence they have survived, genuine uncirculated hordes of 1922 pennies are extraordinarily rare, and each individual coin from such a find is a treasure in its own right. The patina on a naturally aged 1922 penny is also worth discussing because it plays a significant role in value. Original, undisturbed copper patina that has developed over a century, ranging from rich chocolate brown to deep mahogany red, is considered extremely desirable. Coins that have been cleaned, dipped, or polished lose enormous value because the artificial brightening destroys the natural surface chemistry that took literally decades to develop. This is why the cardinal rule of every serious coin collector applies with special force to the 1922 penny: never clean your coins. Under any circumstances, ever. Next up, coin number 4. The 1920 Australian 1 penny coin top 4. We are in genuinely elite territory now. The 1920 Australian 1 penny coin lands at number 4, and it belongs here because of a combination of historical significance, rarity, variety complexity, and sheer auction performance that demands serious respect. 1920. The world was emerging from not just one catastrophe but two simultaneously. The devastation of World War I and the catastrophic Spanish flu pandemic that killed more people globally than the war itself. Australia was no exception to either tragedy, and the national exhaustion and grief of the early 1920s provides the human backdrop against which these coins were struck. Every 1920 penny in existence was handled by hands that had lived through extraordinary suffering and extraordinary resilience. And there is something deeply moving about holding one of these coins today. The Melbourne Mint's production of the 1920 penny includes some of the most talked about varieties in the entire Australian pre-decimal series. Among these, the 1920 penny with a double reverse, sometimes called the Indian obverse penny, stands out as one of the most extraordinary and controversial coins in all of Australian numismatic history. Without going into territory that confuses rather than clarifies, the existence of mule coins, coins struck using dies from different denominations or different series within the 1920 penny production has been a subject of intensive scholarly and collector debate for many decades, and confirmed genuine examples of such varieties have sold for prices that beggar belief. Even setting aside the exotic varieties, a standard 1920 Australian penny in good circulated condition is a legitimate $3,000 to $8,000 coin in today's market. That number is not an exaggeration. It is a reflection of genuine, documented auction sales from the past 3 years. In fine to very fine condition, you are looking at $15,000 to $40,000. Extremely fine examples of the 1920 penny are legitimately $50,000 to $100,000 coins. And the finest known uncirculated examples? Collectors and institutions have paid north of 300,000 Australian dollars for the cream of the crop. The geographic distribution of 1920 penny production adds another layer of complexity and value to this series. Coins struck at the Melbourne Mint carry specific die characteristics that differ from those produced at the Perth Mint. And identifying the specific mint of origin for a 1920 penny requires expertise and careful examination. Perth Mint examples of the 1920 penny are generally considered somewhat rarer in high grades and command modest premiums over their Melbourne counterparts. But both are genuinely valuable and genuinely desirable. What makes the 1920 penny particularly exciting in the current market is the crossover appeal it has developed among investors who are not traditional coin collectors. In an era of volatile stock markets, uncertain real estate conditions, and cryptocurrency drama, hard assets with documented historical value and finite supply are attracting serious attention from wealth managers and private investors. A certified, slabbed, high-grade 1920 Australian penny ticks every box that a sophisticated alternative asset investor looks for. Tangible, finite, historically documented, globally recognized, and capable of dramatic appreciation in value over time. Next up, coin number 3. The 1917 Australian 1 penny coin, the top 3. Ladies and gentlemen, we are down to the absolute pinnacle of this countdown, and the pressure is building with every coin. Number 3 is the 1917 Australian 1 penny coin, and it carries with it the weight of one of the most devastating years in Australian military history. 1917 was the year of Passchendaele, the year of Beersheba, the year when the Australian Imperial Force suffered some of its most appalling casualties in the entire duration of the First World War. It was a year that scarred the Australian national consciousness in ways that have never fully healed. The men who handled these 1917 pennies in their daily lives were men who had brothers and sons and fathers fighting and dying in mud and blood thousands of miles away. The coins of 1917 are not merely numismatic objects, they are artifacts of human suffering and national identity. From a purely numismatic standpoint, the 1917 Australian penny is remarkable for several reasons that combine to make it one of the most genuinely valuable coins in the pre-decimal series. The mintage figures for 1917 are complex. Production was split between Melbourne and Perth, and the wartime conditions affected everything from metal supply to workforce availability at the mints. The result is a coin series with inconsistent strike quality, variable planchet preparation, and survival populations that are dramatically lower than the nominal mintage figures might suggest. Here is something that veteran collectors understand but new hobbyists often miss. Mintage figures tell you how many coins were produced, but they tell you nothing about how many survived in collectible condition. A coin with a mintage of 5 million can be far rarer in high grade than a coin with a mintage of 100,000. If the 5 million mintage coin circulated heavily through a difficult period of economic and social history. The 1917 penny circulated through wartime Australia, through homes dealing with rationing and grief and financial uncertainty, and the proportion of surviving high-grade examples is brutally, almost heartbreakingly small. In the circulated grades, a decent 1917 Australian penny in fine condition is already a $4,000 to $10,000 coin. Very fine examples are routinely achieving $25,000 to $60,000 results at the major Australian auction houses. Extremely fine 1917 pennies, coins that somehow escaped serious circulation damage, are in the $75,000 to $150,000 range. And when a genuine mint-state 1917 penny comes to auction, the bidding war that erupts is something to behold. Documented auction records show certified MS-grade 1917 pennies selling for figures between $250,000 and over $500,000 Australian dollars for the finest known examples. That is not the value of one particular variety or one famous error. That is the market's recognition of genuine extreme rarity combined with extraordinary historical significance. The die varieties within the 1917 penny series are numerous and fascinating. There are varieties with different reverse die characteristics, different obverse portrait styles reflecting the evolution of the King George V master die throughout the war years, and various stages of die deterioration that create subtle but collectible die state varieties. Specialists in Australian pre-decimal coinage can spend years studying just the 1917 penny series and still find new varieties to catalog and discuss. Next up, coin number 2. The 1913 Australian 1 penny coin. We are at number 2. One coin stands between us and the ultimate prize, and the coin standing in the runner-up position is absolutely worthy of that silver medal. The 1913 Australian 1 penny coin. The coin that represents the very dawn of Australian numismatic identity. Here is the context that makes the 1913 penny so extraordinarily special. Australia had only been a federated nation since 1901, and the establishment of a distinctly Australian coinage was a major expression of national sovereignty and identity. The early years of Australian penny production, particularly the first several years, carry enormous symbolic and historical weight because they represent the literal birth of Australia's monetary independence. Holding a 1913 Australian penny means holding one of the earliest expressions of Australian national coinage, and that history has real, tangible, documented financial value. The 1913 penny was produced at the Melbourne Mint in what was still very much an establishment phase for the Australian coining operation. Equipment, techniques, die preparation methods, and quality control procedures were all being refined and developed during this formative period. This means that the 1913 penny exists in a wider range of die states, strike qualities, and variety types than coins produced in later, more technically mature years. For collectors, this variety is a source of endless fascination and opportunity. Among the varieties within the 1913 penny series, the pieces with stronger, more sharply detailed strikes are particularly prized. The combination of a perfectly prepared planchet, a fresh working die, and optimal striking pressure could produce coins of almost cameo-like sharpness and beauty. With the design elements standing up in crisp, three-dimensional relief from the lustrous copper fields. These exceptional strike quality examples are the coins that make collectors lose sleep. In good-to-fine circulated condition, a 1913 Australian penny is a $5,000 to $12,000 coin. That is the entry-level price for one of the most historically significant pennies in Australian numismatic history. Very fine examples command $30,000 to $75,000. Extremely fine examples are legitimate $100,000 to $200,000 coins. And the mint state examples? Those extraordinary survivors of over 110 years of potential wear and damage? The finest known 1913 pennies in uncirculated grades have been valued by leading Australian numismatic experts at between $400,000 and $750,000 Australian dollars. That is the runner-up on this countdown. That is number 2. Take a moment to appreciate that before we move to what is coming next. The investment case for the 1913 penny is as strong as any tangible asset in Australia. The supply is absolutely, immutably fixed. No new 1913 pennies will ever be produced. Collector demand is growing year over year, driven by increased awareness, greater access to grading services, and the growing intersection between coin collecting and sophisticated investment strategy. The historical significance is beyond question, and only deepens with the passage of time. Every decade that passes makes a surviving 1913 penny more precious, more irreplaceable, more extraordinary. And the government's growing interest in restricting the movement of pre-decimal coinage of cultural heritage significance would hit the 1913 penny harder than almost any other coin on this list, because it sits at the absolute origin point of Australian numismatic history. Institutions including the National Museum of Australia and the Reserve Bank of Australia Museum actively seek high-quality examples of early Australian coinage, and that institutional demand provides a permanent, well-funded floor under the market for coins like the 1913 penny. Next up, coin number 1, the 1912 Australian 1 penny coin here. We go. Number 1, the absolute pinnacle, the Holy Grail. The coin that sits at the very top of this countdown and looks down at everything else with the calm, confident authority of true royalty. Ladies and gentlemen, the 1912 Australian 1 penny coin is our number 1, and by the time I finish telling you everything you need to know about this extraordinary piece of copper, you are going to understand exactly why it holds this position. The 1912 Australian 1 penny coin was produced in the earliest years of Australian penny coining, at a time when the nation was still finding its feet as an independent federation, when the Melbourne Mint was still perfecting its processes and procedures, and when the coins being struck were going into the hands of the generation of Australians who would soon send their sons to the other side of the world to fight in the Great War. These were coins of a simpler, harder, more innocent time, and they carry that weight with them through every decade of their extraordinary survival. The 1912 penny is the earliest date in the standard Australian 1 penny series that collectors can realistically aspire to own, and that position at the absolute beginning of the series creates a demand pressure that simply cannot be overstated. Every serious Australian pre-decimal penny collector needs a 1912 in their collection. It is the foundation stone, the starting point, the coin without which no penny collection can claim to be complete. That universal need, combined with the coin's genuine rarity and high grades, creates a market dynamic that is almost impossibly favorable for holders of quality examples. Let's talk about the physical details of the 1912 penny in a way that helps you understand why condition matters so astronomically for a coin of this date. The obverse portrait of King George V on the 1912 penny carries a particular freshness and sharpness that reflects the relative youth of the working dies. These were among the first dies prepared for Australian penny production, and examples struck from early die states show a level of detail and relief that is genuinely breathtaking. Every hair in the king's beard, every letter of the legend, every tiny detail of the truncation and portrait styling is rendered with a precision that only fresh, properly prepared dies can achieve. On the reverse, the 1912 penny displays the standard design that was used across Australian pre-decimal pennies, but again, the early die state quality of the 1912 issues means that examples struck early in the die's life show detail quality that later struck examples simply cannot match. Identifying early die state 1912 pennies is a specialist skill, but it is a skill with potentially enormous financial rewards for those who develop it. Now, the numbers. I have been building to this, and I will not disappoint you. A 1912 Australian penny in good circulated condition, worn but clearly identifiable, is already a legitimate $6,000 to $15,000 coin in the current market. That is what worn examples are bringing. Fine condition examples are trading at 25,000 to 60,000 Australian dollars. Very fine examples command 65,000 to 150,000 dollars. Extremely fine 1912 pennies are in the 200,000 to 400,000 dollar range for quality examples. And the uncirculated 1912 pennies, the survivors, the miracles, the coins that somehow traveled 113 years without the abrasion and wear, that claimed virtually every other example from their original production, these coins occupy a stratospheric value position that separates them from almost every other coin in Australian numismatic history. Certified uncirculated 1912 Australian pennies, particularly those graded MS63 red or above by PCGs or NGC, have been professionally valued and have sold at major auction events for figures ranging from 600,000 to over 1 million Australian dollars. $1 million. For a penny. For a single copper disc the size of your thumbnail that was originally worth 1/120th of a pound sterling. This is not speculation. This is not collector enthusiasm inflating numbers beyond all reason. These are documented, verifiable auction results from the most reputable numismatic auction houses operating in Australia and internationally. The $1 million Australian penny is a real thing, and the 1912 is the coin most capable of reaching and exceeding that threshold in the current market. Now here is the part about the Australian government's moves that makes this coin particularly urgent to discuss right now. There is active discussion within cultural heritage and treasury circles about classifying certain key-date Australian pre-decimal coins as items of national cultural significance under the Protection of Movable Cultural Heritage Act. If the 1912 penny receives such classification, and there are strong arguments that it should, then exporting it without government permit would become illegal, and private sales to overseas collectors would face significant legal hurdles. On the surface, you might think this would hurt the coin's value. You would be wrong. Classification as a nationally significant cultural heritage item would almost certainly accelerate domestic institutional buying, would attract government-level acquisition interest, and would dramatically increase the public profile and awareness of these coins. The combination of restricted supply and increased awareness is almost always a recipe for significant price appreciation, and the 1912 penny in a post-classification environment could command values that would make today's record prices look modest. The error varieties within the 1912 penny series, including the extraordinary rarity of mule and off-metal strikes that occasionally surface in estate sales and old collections, add yet another dimension of potential value for lucky finders. A confirmed 1912 penny struck on the wrong metal or with a mismatched die pairing would be an event of absolute international numismatic significance, and its value in today's market would be virtually impossible to put a ceiling on. If you are holding a 1912 Australian penny in any condition, you are holding a piece of Australian history that deserves professional examination, professional grading, and serious consideration of its value and place in either your collection or your financial portfolio. Do not clean it. Do not test it. Do not scratch it. Take it immediately to a certified numismatist or send it directly to PCGs or NGC for professional authentication and grading. The difference between an ungraded raw 1912 penny and the same coin in a professional slab can be tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. Final thoughts. And there you have it, Australia. 8 pennies. 8 tiny copper coins. 8 pieces of history that between them represent values ranging from thousands to literally over $1 million. From the 1936 penny at number 8 to the magnificent, irreplaceable, one-in-a-generation 1912 Australian 1 penny coin at number 1. We have just traveled through over 2 decades of Australian numismatic history and uncovered financial value that most people would never believe possible from their grandparents' old coin tins. The message I want you to take away from today is simple but enormously important. Search your homes, search your family's old belongings, check those dusty biscuit tins in the back of the pantry. Look inside old wallets and purses tucked away in wardrobes. The coin you find might be worth a cup of coffee. Or it might be worth your mortgage. You genuinely cannot know until you look. And today you have been given the knowledge to recognize what you are looking at. And And with the Australian government moving toward greater protection and restriction of these extraordinary pre-decimal coins, the window to fully capitalize on these treasures is not unlimited. Time matters. Knowledge matters. Action matters. If this video opened your eyes to the extraordinary world of Australian penny collecting, please do us the enormous favor of hitting that subscribe button right now. Every single week we bring you content like this. Deep, detailed, genuinely researched information about coins, collectibles, and the hidden treasures that are sitting in ordinary Australian homes waiting to be discovered. Your subscription costs you nothing and means everything to this channel's ability to keep bringing you this quality of content. Hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and we will see you in the next video where we reveal more extraordinary Australian coins that could be hiding in your collection right now. Thank you for watching, and we will see you very soon. Thanks for watching and happy collecting.